He stood up, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't show them a single thing they could use against him. Just stood up, and the whole cabin watched a black man get removed from his own seat, onto his own plane, by people who worked for him. Nobody knew that yet. The man who took his seat was already ordering coffee. The crew was already moving on. 64 passengers were already looking back at their phones. Somewhere in seat 4B, a camera was running. What happened next didn't just change one flight. It changed everything. The first thing you noticed about Damon Reeves was what he didn't do. He walked into the business class cabin at 6:09 in the morning and sat down. No scan of the room, no settling in ritual, no small performance of arrival. Just the briefcase under the seat in front of him, the folder open before the seatbelt was fastened, the pen already moving in the margin for the boarding announcement had finished playing through the overhead speakers. He was 44 years old, and he had taken this route 41 times in the last 2 years. He knew where the outlet was. He knew which side of the plane caught the morning glare. He knew that the coffee on Horizon's Atlanta departure was better than the coffee on the return, for reasons he had never investigated and didn't need to. He ordered it without looking up. Coffee, black, no sugar. The flight attendant said something pleasant and moved away, and Damon turned a page. Outside the oval window, the Atlanta tarmac was still dark. Ground crews moved in the yellow wash of service lights, small and purposeful against the gray morning. A fuel truck idled near the wing, the whole operation running on its own logic, indifferent to the hour. Damon had a quarterly earnings breakdown open in front of him, numbers he had already memorized. He read them again anyway because that one is how he worked, not because he didn't trust his memory, but because the meaning of numbers shifted depending on what question you brought to them. Last week, the projections had told him one thing. This week, after a conversation with Adrian about the secondary fund timeline, they were telling him something slightly different. Same numbers, different question. He circled something in the margin, drew a line to a note from 9 days ago, turned back 2 pages, circled something there too. 3 other passengers had settled into the business class cabin around him. A woman in her late 50s with noise-canceling headphones already sealed over her ears, occupying 3C with the settled authority of someone who had done this commute so many times that the plane was essentially an extension of her living room. A younger man in 5A who'd asked for the Wi-Fi password before he was fully in his seat. An older gentleman across the aisle who was reorganizing the contents of the overhead bin with the focused intensity of a man who had opinions about luggage placement and was not keeping them to himself. None of them looked at Damon. He didn't notice. The coffee arrived. He moved it to the tray table without looking at it. Went back to the folder. Outside, the sky was beginning to do something at its eastern edge. Not light yet. Just a suggestion of a direction that light would eventually come from. The ground crews kept moving. The fuel truck idled. The terminal sat in its own glow behind the glass, waiting for the day to accelerate into something it recognized. Seat 4A. Atlanta to New York. 6:09 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt at this moment like every other Tuesday. It wasn't. But Damon didn't know that yet. Craig Barton came at 6:17. You heard him before you placed him. Not because he was loud, he wasn't, not in any way would that register as a complaint. But there was a frequency to the way certain men moved through spaces they considered theirs. And Craig Barton had spent 57 years moving through spaces he considered his. The carry-on rolling behind him had the scuffed confidence of a bag that had survived 100 business trips, and wore each one as a credential. The polo shirt was expensive in the way that expensive things look when they're trying not to look expensive. The silver at his temples was the silver of a man who had decided silver suited him. He came down the aisle and reached row 4 and stopped. He looked at the seat number above the row, looked at the man in the seat, looked at the number again. Then he said it, not loudly, almost helpfully, like he was doing Damon a service. "Hey, I think you've got the wrong seat." Damon didn't look up. Craig waited, the particular wait of a man who is accustomed to being responded to and is recalibrating in real time around the fact that he isn't. "Sir, this is 4A. Damon turned a page. Craig Barton was not, in his own accounting of himself, a difficult man. He was a businessman. He was efficient. He had places to be, meetings that required him, a schedule that didn't accommodate delays or confusion or the stubborn silence of a stranger in his assigned seat. He had been flying business class for 23 years. He knew what 4A looked like. He knew it the way he knew his parking spot at his office building and his usual table at his usual lunch place, not because he had memorized it, but because familiarity had made it his in some way that preceded the actual facts. The actual fact, which was printed on a boarding pass currently in Craig's breast pocket, was that his seat was 4C. He had not checked. "I'm sorry, I don't think you heard me." His voice was still even, still calibrated toward helpful. "This is seat 4A, I'm pretty sure that's mine." Damon said nothing. And here is the thing about that silence that made it different from rudeness or defiance or any of the other categories Craig was still cycling through in his attempt to understand it. Damon wasn't performing. He wasn't making a statement. He was simply not responding to a premise he hadn't accepted. The premise being, you are probably in the wrong place. Damon had heard that premise before. Not always in words, sometimes in a look. Sometimes in the particular quality of a pause before a handshake, or the reflexive movement of a hand toward a phone in a situation where no call needed to be made, or the way a security guard's posture shifted when Damon walked through a lobby in a city where no one knew who he was. He had been hearing that premise since he was 19 years old and walked into his first real job interview in downtown Atlanta. And the receptionist has asked him twice in two different ways whether he was sure he was in the right place. He was sure. He had always been sure. And he had learned over the long education of being a black man moving through spaces that had not been designed with in mind that the most expensive thing he could spend in those moments was the assumption that explaining himself would help. So he didn't explain himself. He turned another page. Craig's jaw set, the small muscle at the hinge of it. He turned toward the aisle looking for resolution, and that's when Patrice Holden appeared. Patrice was 50 years old and had been working business class on Horizon flights for 19 years. She had the posture of someone who had spent two decades managing confined spaces and the particular skill of making conflict resolution look like customer service. She was good at her job. She cared about doing it well. She had gotten a commendation 2 years ago for de-escalating a situation involving a passenger who had, at the start of a flight from Atlanta to Dallas, been absolutely certain he was having a heart attack, and by the time they landed, had been identified as a man having his first experience with severe anxiety and the dry air of a pressurized cabin. Patrice was not a bad person. That was the important thing to understand about what happened next. What happened next had nothing to do with her being bad. She came down the aisle and took in the situation in the way she had learned to take in situations, quickly from the available visual data before anyone had said a word to her. A standing passenger, a seated passenger. The standing passenger's posture communicating complaint. The seated passenger's posture communicating, she read it as uncertainty, as someone who had perhaps sat in the wrong seat and hadn't yet been confronted with the information clearly enough to process it. She was wrong about that. But the read had happened before she'd heard a syllable from either of them, and reads that happen before information arrives are the hardest kind to correct, because by the time the information comes, you're already building around the architecture of the first impression. "Is there a seating issue here?" she said, and she said it, without being aware of it, in a direction that was slightly more towards Damon than toward Craig. Craig, immediately. "Yes, I think there's been a mix-up. This gentleman is in my seat." Patrice turned to Damon. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" Damon looked up for the first time. He looked at Patrice for a moment, not with anger, not with the exhausted performance of a man who has explained himself too many times, with something that took her a beat to identify and that she would think about for a long time afterward. It was the look of a man who already knew how this was going to go, who had decided in advance that he would let it go however it went, and who was choosing, deliberately and without drama, to hand over the document she'd asked for. He reached into his breast pocket, produced the boarding pass, held it out. Patrice took it, looked at it. Seat 4A, Horizon Airlines Flight 5112, Atlanta to New York. The thing printed at the top, Damon T. Reeves. She looked at it for longer than she needed to. Craig leaned slightly toward her to see it, and she angled it unconsciously away from him, which was interesting because it meant some part of her understood that this was Damon's document and not Craig's business. But she was still holding it. still turning it over in her mind, looking for what she expected to find, which was the error that explained everything. "Our system sometimes generates duplicate assignments," she said. Her voice was warm and professional, and completely certain that this was true, because it was true, it hadn't happened here. "It's not common, but it does occur." Craig, without missing a beat. "Right, that must be what happened here." Damon said nothing, because what Patrice had just done. And this was not malice, this was not cruelty, this was the specific and invisible machinery of assumption, was take a valid boarding pass and reframe it as a possible error. She had looked at proof and seen a question. She had given Craig's certainty and Damon's documentation equal weight in a situation where they were not equal. Had a boarding pass with 4A on it. One man had an untested conviction that 4A was his. Patrice had treated them as a tie. Craig smiled. It was small. He didn't know he was doing it. "So what do we do?" he said to Patrice, not to Damon. Zara O.C. in seat 4B had been watching all of this since the moments. Craig said, "I think you've got the wrong seat." She was 26 years old, and she was tired in the specific way that third-year law students are tired at 6:17 in the morning at the end of a semester, the tiredness that lives behind the eyes and makes everything feel slightly louder than it is. She had a constitutional law final tomorrow. She had eaten a granola bar in the cab from her apartment, and she was not entirely sure she had turned off her coffee maker, and she had been trying for the last 20 minutes to get question about promissory estoppel to stop circling her brain and sit down somewhere she could look at it clearly. She had not managed it. And then Craig Barton had said those 7 words, and something in Zara had stopped doing everything else it was doing and gone very, very quiet. She knew this moment. Not this exact location, not these exact people, but this shape, this architecture. She had been in variations of this moment enough times that her body recognized it before her brain had finished processing it. The moment when a person decided, before asking a single question or checking a single document, that you were somewhere you didn't belong. In her second year of law school, she had walked into a study room that required a student ID to access. She had her ID she'd had badged in. She had sat down at a table with her casebooks and her laptop, and a second-year student had come in behind her, looked at her, and said, "Sorry, is this your first time using this room? Because it's actually for law students only." She had shown him her ID. He had said, oh, sorry, and sat down at another table. 2 weeks later, she saw him in her contracts class, and he clearly didn't recognize her. She had not said anything at the time. She had opened her laptop and started working. Because in that moment, as in most of those moments, the calculation of what it cost to say something versus what it cost to say nothing had run very fast in her head and come out in favor of silence. She was not going to be silent now. She picked up her phone. Quietly, without moving much, she opened the camera and pointed it at row 4 and pressed record. She wasn't going to live stream. Not yet. She wasn't sure she was going to do anything with it at all. She knew what happened to these moments when there was no record of them. They got smoothed, they became misunderstandings and mix-ups, and nobody meant any harm. The edges got sanded down until the thing that had happened stopped looking like the thing that had happened. So she recorded. Captain Boyd Garrett came out of the cockpit at 6:23. He was 56 years old and had 28 years in commercial aviation, 14 of them as a captain. He ran his flights with the kind of methodical precision that made his crew comfortable and his passengers safe and his ground operations reasonably predictable. He was not a man who tolerated unnecessary complications. Not because he was unreasonable, but because he understood in a structural way that in aviation, unnecessary complications compounded. Since a small delay became cascade. He had seen it enough times to respect the principle. He came out of the cockpit to sign off on a weight and balance update from his first officer. He was walking toward the forward galley when he noticed the cluster at row 4. He stopped, assessed Patrice standing in the aisle. A man standing with a carry-on park. A man sitting in 4A with a folder open. The standing man's body language communicating grievance. The sitting man's body language communicating nothing at all. Garrett ran his lenses read in 466. Standing man has a claim. Sitting man isn't resolution. He walked over. "What's the issue here?" "Craig." "I have 4A. He's in my seat." Garrett looked at Patrice. She gave him the small, apologetic half-shrug of someone in the middle of something she hadn't yet resolved. The system may have generated a duplicate assignment. Garrett looked at Damon. And here is where the thing happened that was going to take Boyd Garrett a long time to fully understand, because it required him to look at something in Sam's self that men of his particular formation, practical, efficient, fair by his own measurement, were not accustomed to examining. He looked at the two men in front of him, and in 4 seconds he made a call. And the call was based on information he could not have articulated, because it was not the kind of information you articulate. It was the kind that arrives before language does, before reasoning does. It comes from whatever gets built inside you over decades of living in a particular kind of world, seeing a particular arrangement of things, learning without being explicitly taught what the normal version of a situation looks like. The normal version of this situation, in the calculus that lived somewhere below Garrett's conscious mind, involved someone being asked to demonstrate that they belonged. And the someone his eyes went to was Damon. "Sir," he said, "I need you to step off the policeman verifier assignment at the gate desk." The cabin went quiet, not loudly, not a gasp, just the quality of the air changed. Woman in 3C lowered her headphones. The young man in 5A stopped typing. The older gentleman across the aisle became very still, because 64 people in that cabin had just heard the same thing, even if they processed it differently. The man who was sitting down, not arguing, not raising his voice, with a borbulous he had already produced, was asked to leave. The man who was standing in the aisle, making the noise, pushing the claim, whose boarding pass had not been asked for or examined, was not. Damon closed his folder. He did it the way he did most things, completely. Tab aligned to tab, edge to edge, set it on the seat beside him, pen on top. He picked up his coffee, which had arrived while Craig was still talking, and set it on the tray table. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket, smoothed the lapel once, and he looked at Boyd Garrett, not with the heat of a man who wants a fight, not with the deflation of a man who has lost one, with the level, contained gaze of someone who has run this calculation before and has already decided, before the other person speaks, what they are and are not going to spend on this moment. Said it quietly. So quietly that only Garrett caught it. "Captain, make sure you're certain about this." Garrett blinked. The sentence landed somewhere uncomfortable. Not because it was a threat, it wasn't a threat. Not because it was aggressive, the voice hadn't been aggressive. Because it had the quality of a sentence that already knew something Garrett didn't, and was giving him a last chance to catch up. "Sir, I need you to." But Damon had already picked up his briefcase, already stepped into the aisle, already walking at his own pace toward the front of the aircraft. Garrett stood in the aisle and watched him go. The sentence was still doing something in his chest. "Make sure you're certain about this." 7 words. He turned them over once more, couldn't find where to put them, and went back to the cockpit. Craig Barton settled into seat 4A. The jet bridge was empty at 6:26 in the morning. One overhead light, the low machine hum of ventilation, the muffled sound of the terminal beyond, arriving in fragments through the sealed walls. Damon walked off the jet bridge and into the gate area and stopped. He set his briefcase down on the floor beside him and stood there, just stood there, not performing anything, not holding himself together through gritted force. He had learned, over the long course of being who he was in the world as it was, that the hot immediate wire of this moment eventually passed through a kind of metabolic process, and not cold, not gone, just different. Something that didn't shake your hands but found somewhere else to live. Something that burned on a long cycle, low and clean, the way certain materials burn when you give them the right conditions. His father had known about that kind of burning. Bernard Reeves had worked construction electrical in Macon, Georgia for 31 years. Master electrician's license for 26 of them. Had never shown a blade, had never been firebird, had been, by every professional measure the industry offered, exactly and completely what he said he was. In 1989, a site manager named Gerald Pell had looked at Bernard's license paperwork and said he needed to verify it. The paperwork was flawless. The paperwork was always flawless, because Bernard had understood early that his paperwork needed to be flawless in ways that Gerald Pell's paperwork did not. That was the arrangement. You carried twice the documentation. You arrived twice as prepared. You held twice as still when someone looked at you with a question you hadn't invited. Bernard went home. Came back the next morning with 3 additional forms of verification and the same quiet face he always wore. Reinstated by noon. Gerald Pell shook his hand and said sorry for the trouble. Went back to his office. No one asked Gerald Pell anything. Bernard had never said a word to Damon about that specific day. What he said instead over the years, in the ongoing and unhurried way that fathers say the things that end up mattering, was this. The fire that burns fast leaves ash. The fire that burns slow moves mountains. Damon stood in the jet bridge corridor and let that sentence do what it always did, which was settles into the base of him like something structural, something load-bearing. Then he walked to the gate desk. Glenn Murdoch was 38 years old and had worked Horizon Airlines gate operations for 11 years. He'd processed passengers through weather delays, gate changes, mechanical holds, the particular chaos of holiday travel when every human being in the country seemed to believe that their connection was the most important connection currently in jeopardy. He was methodical. He was fair. He tried not to make assumptions, which is different from not making them, but is still something. When he approached the desk, Glenn asked for ID and boarding passes in the steed sequence. Damon put both on the counter. Glenn pulled up the booking system, typed in the confirmation number, looked at the screen, stopped. He looked at the ID, looked at the screen, looked at the ID again. The name in the system was attached to a booking code Glenn had encountered twice in 11 years of gate operations. A code that existed in Horizon's internal system under a designation that most agents never thought about because it almost never appeared in the context of a chartered seat dispute. Primary shareholder. Chairman. Glenn looked at Damon Reeves, standing at his counter with a briefcase and a folder, and an expression that was patient in a way that suggested the patience had been practiced for a long time and in many locations. Something moved through Glenn Murdoch's face. He couldn't have named it cleanly. Recognition was part of it, and something that lived in the neighborhood of fury, controlled, professional, pressed down below the surface where it belonged on the job, but there, clearly there, in the set of his shoulders and careful way he took his next breath. Because Glenn's knew exactly what had happened on that aircraft. He didn't need to be told. He had worked this gate, this terminal, this city for 11 years. He had seen the shape of this thing many times. He had been on the receiving end of versions of it himself, in this building in this uniform, being asked by passengers whether he was the real gate agent, or whether there was someone else he could get. He looked at Damon. Mr. Reeves, he said. His voice was level and careful. Your seat assignment is correct. There was no system error. Damon nodded once. I need to make a call before you reboard, Glenn said. I know, Damon said. Glenn reached for his radio. Back in the cabins, seat 4A. Craig Barton had arranged himself with the efficiency of a man reclaiming what was rightfully his, carry-on properly stowed. His own folder, thinner than Damon's, carrying fewer margin notes, open on the tray table. He'd been offered a coffee and accepted without particular thought. He felt the particular ease of a situation resolved, of having been right and having been vindicated and having been given what was his. He was not an introspective man in the way that required him to examine the foundations of that feeling. The situation had been incorrect. Now it was correct. He had a flight to catch and a meeting in New York and a schedule that required him to be in a particular place at a particular time. He took a sip of coffee and looked at his folder. Zara Osei had not moved. She was sitting in seat 4B with her phone face up on the tray table, camera app closed, watching the empty seat beside her. Watching Craig's profile, watching Patrice move through the cabin with the slightly distant expression of someone doing a job while another part of her brain was somewhere else entirely. Zara turned her phone over, opened a search browser, typed in what she'd seen on Damon's boarding pass in the brief moment Patrice had held it. The last name, the airline, the city, Damon Reeves, Atlanta Horizon Airlines. The first result was Forbes. 2022. She tapped it. The page loaded slowly on the airport Wi-Fi. An image came in first before the text. A man in a dark blazer, no logo, no pin, sitting across from a sparse desk in what appeared to be an office with window and almost nothing on the walls, looking at the camera with the patient, level gaze of a man who had been asked to be photographed and was cooperating without performing. The headline came in beneath the image. The quiet billionaire who owns more of the sky than you think. Zara looked at the image for a moment, looked at the empty seat beside her. looked at Craig Barton, who was sipping his coffee and reading his folder with the settled ease of a man who had handled an inconvenience and moved on. Her thumb hovered over the phone for a long moment. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't an activist with a platform. She was 26 years old and had a constitutional law final tomorrow and had spent the better part of 2 years learning in careful and rigorous detail how systems worked and why they produced the outcomes they produced and what the legal architecture behind those outcomes looked like when you examined it without flinching. She knew what the outcome of the last 20 minutes looked like when you examined it without flinching. She opened her live broadcast app, checked the frame. 4 was visible as a background, Craig visible in it. She kept her voice low and her face a steady. "I'm on a flight," she said, "and I just watched my man get removed from his own seat. I'm going to let you watch what happens when he comes back." She turned the camera slightly toward the front of the aircraft, kept it running. A viewer count appeared in the corner of the screen. 0, then 4, then 11, then 37. Then it started she could in fact track individual numbers, and she stopped trying. In the comments, someone pasted a link. She didn't look at it. She already knew what it was. Craig Barton, in seat 4A, had no idea any of this was happening. He was reading his folder. He was drinking his coffee. He was thinking, in the background of his attention, about his meeting. He did not know that 43 seconds after Zara pressed the button, someone in the comments typed, "Wait, is that who I think it is?" And did not know that 11 seconds after that, someone else typed, "That's Damon Reeves," and included the Forbes link, and that the number of Zara's screen was no longer moving in increments she could track. It was moving the way a current moves when a river narrows, the way certain things move when they find the right channel, and the conditions turn in their favor, and there is simply no containing them anymore. Damon came back on the plane at 6:31. Glenn had made his call. The call had gone up and come with a very specific answer. Damon T. Reeves was in his correct and assigned seat. There had been no system error. There was no duplicate assignment. The passenger currently in seat 4A needed to relocate. Craig Barton was asked to move. He said, "I don't understand." He said, "I've had this seat for months." He said, "Can someone explain to me what is actually happening here?" in the tone of a man accustomed to explanations being produced for his satisfaction on request. Patrice held the line. "Sir, this seat was assigned to another passenger. There was no error in the system. I apologize for any confusion." She said it 3 times in slightly different configurations, until Craig heard it clearly enough to understand that this particular resolution was not going to bend toward him. He gathered his folder. He moved. Damon walked back down the aisle at his own pace. He reached row 4. He looked at the empty seat. He sat down. He moved the tray table back to its position, picked up his coffee, which Patrice had, quietly and without comment, replaced while he was gone, still black, still no sugar, still the right temperature. He opened his folder, found the page, started reading, like he had never left. The woman in 3C had her headphones around her neck. The young man in 5A had stopped looking at his laptop. The older gentleman across the aisle was no longer concerned with luggage arrangements. Several passengers in the rows behind had their phones at angles that were not quite casual. Craig sat in his correctly assigned seat, 4C as it has always been, and looked at the man in 4A reading his quarterly reports. Craig was trying to locate the feeling he'd had 20 minutes ago when he walked into this cabin and knew, immediately and without checking, that the man in seat 4A was in the wrong place. He was trying to locate it and examine it, and it kept sliding out from under the examination. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A message from his business partner. He read it once. The sentence was not long, but it required him to read it twice more before it fully arrived. "Craig, please tell me you didn't just try to remove Damon Reeves from his own seat." Craig looked at Damon. Damon turned a page, reached for his coffee, set it back down. His eyes did not move from the document in front of him. Craig's thumbs hovered over his phone screen. He did not type back, because the question his partner had asked was not actually a question. It was the sound of someone already knowing the answer, asking for the comfort of being wrong. And Craig had nothing to offer on that front phone. He did not know yet the full dimensions of what the answer meant. He did not know about the Forbes cover, or the 61%, or the live broadcast that was currently being watched by several thousand people who were watching him sit in a seat he had claimed by assumption. He did not know any of that yet. What he knew, sitting in 4C with an unanswered message and a coffee going cold, was that something had shifted in the last 20 minutes in a way he had not planned for and could not currently see the edges of. The plane had not moved. They were still at the gate. The departure board in the terminal would be showing a delay. Outside the window, the Atlanta tarmac had grown lighter in the last half hour. The ground crews were still moving. The fuel truck was gone. At the eastern edge of the sky, through the oval window on the left side of the aircraft, the light was becoming something more than a suggestion. Thin and pale and arriving without announcement, the way mornings arrive when no one is watching for them. Zara kept the camera steady. The number in the corner kept climbing, and Damon Reeves sat in seat 4A and read his quarter inches and turned his page at his face, the pen moving occasionally in the margin, the coffee at his elbow, the briefcase under the seat in front of him. Exactly where he had always been, exactly where he was always going to be. The plane did not take off at 6:15. It did not take off at 6:30 either. At 6:34, a Horizons Airlines ground supervisor named Carla Webb, no relation to anyone on the board, just a woman who had been managing gate operations at Hartsfield-Jackson for 16 years and had seen most things, made a call to the maintenance coordinator and requested a technical hold on Flight 5112. The reason entered into the system was a routine hydraulic pressure check on the nose gear assembly. The reason that did not get entered into the system was that Carla had been listening to her radio for the last 8 minutes and had heard enough to understand that there was a situation on that aircraft that needed time to resolve properly before 64 people went 38,000 feet into the air with unfinished business in row 4. Carla was good at her job. Part of being good at her job was knowing when a problem needed paperwork and when it needed something else. She gave it time. In seat 4, Dame was aimed on page 37 of his quarterly earnings breakdown. He had been on page 37 for 11 minutes, which was longer than page 37 warranted. The numbers were not doing anything complicated, but his eyes were moving across them without taking them in. And he was aware of that, and he let it be true for a while without fighting it. He had learned that too, that there were moments when the machinery of your own concentration simply refused to run at full capacity. And his intelligent response was not to force it, but to let it idle. Let the moment pass through you the way weather passes. It would clear or it wouldn't, but pushing against it accomplished nothing except burning energy you would need later. He needed his energy for later. He turned to page 38. Craig Barton, in seat 4C, 2 seats away, separated by the empty middle seat of the business class configuration, was not reading anything. His folder was open, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the seat back in front of him with the expression of a man who has just placed a wrong call in a high-stakes game and is sitting with the aftermath of it. Not remorse yet, not fully. More like the preliminary stage before remorse, where you can feel something shifting but haven't yet arrived at the understanding of what it is. His phone was face down on his tray table. He hadn't turned it face up since his partner's message. In seat 4B, Zara had been live for 12 minutes. She wasn't talking much. She had made her opening statement and then turned the camera toward the cabin and let the situation speak for itself, which was a more sophisticated editorial decision than most people her age would have made. And she had made it instinctively, without knowing it was sophisticated. The comments were moving too fast to read individually. She caught fragments, phrases, names, one name appearing over and over, which was the name of the man now reading in seat 4A. And a word that kept appearing next to it, owns, in configurations that people were processing in real time. The way people presclap surprising information when they receive it all at once and have to quickly reorganize what they thought they understood. Zara didn't look at the viewer count. She kept the camera steady. 2 rows back, in seat 6C, Raymond Okafor had his own phone out and was doing something specific with it that had nothing to do with the live stream. Reesand was 61 years old and had been a business journalist for 34 years. He had written for the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and for the last 7 years a newsletter with 40,000 subscribers that focused on corporate governance and institutional power. He had interviewed Damon Reeves once 2 years ago for a piece about the restructuring of mid-size investment funds in the post-pandemic capital environment. He had recognized Damon when he boarded. had thought about saying something, decided against it. Dave's reading clearly did not want conversation. And Raymond was not the kind of journalist who confused access with friendship. He had settled into his seat and opened his own work. He had then tied the last 35 minutes with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was seizing and was quietly documenting it in the notes app on his phone. Because that was what he did when he witnessed things. He was not going to use it without permission. That was a decision he had already made. But he was writing it down while the details were fresh. Cause details always were a thing that disappeared first. At 6:30, Damon's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Adrian. He kept his expression neutral, which required no particular effort, and answered. "Where are you?" she said. Her voice had the quality it got when she was already 3 steps into something and needed him to catch up quickly. "Still on the plane. We're in a hold. I know. I've been watching the feed." He was quiet for a moment. "How many?" 11,000 as of 4 minutes ago. "It's moving fast, Damon. Someone identified you in the comments around the 8-minute mark, and after that it accelerated." She paused. "Raymond Okafor is on your plane. I know. He's gonna want a statement at some point." "At some point," Damon agreed. "Are you?" She stopped, started again. "How are you?" It was a real question. Adrian had been his counsel for 11 years, and she had learned to ask it as a real question, not a formality. She also knew that he would answer it honestly and briefly, and that the answer would tell her what she needed to know about how to proceed. "I'm fine," he said. She accepted. "There's something else? Tell me." "I got a package this morning, 40 minutes ago. Digital drop, anonymous sender routed through a blind address. I've had Marcus look at it." Marcus was her investigator, a former federal auditor who had a particular gift for document authentication. "It's a board meeting transcript. Horizon Airlines, October of last year." Damon said nothing. Let her continue. "There's a proposal in it.
Agenda Item 7.
It's a restructuring of shareholder voting rights in what the document calls operational emergency decisions. The proposed threshold for full bipartisan authority is 65% of outstanding equity." The number sat between them for a moment. Damon owned 61%. "Marcus has verified the document," he said. "Signatures, formatting, metadata. He says it's clean." Who else was in the room? Full board, 11 members. The proposal came from 3 of them jointly. I have the names. "Don't tell me yet," he said. "I want to see the document myself first. I'll send it in 10 minutes, Damon." Her voice shifted slightly, not in volume, in weight. This wasn't an accident. The threshold wasn't chosen randomly. Someone in that room looked at your stake and built the number specifically to exclude you from a category of decisions. "I know," he said, "while still technically keeping you on the board. I know, that's..." She stopped herself from finishing the sentence. Adrian's, his voice was Evans. "Send me the document. I'll call you when we land." He hung up. Outside the window, the Atlanta morning had arrived completely now. The sky above the terminal was a flat, pale blue, the kind that promised heat later. And the tarmac was dry and busy, ground crews moving between planes with the purposeful efficiency of people who worked outdoors and had made their peace with it. Damon looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to page 38. Russell Haynes was 63 years old and had been chairman of Horizon Airlines board for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 2 decades in aviation finance. And before that, he had done 3 years at a management consulting firm in Chicago that had given him, among other things, a durable and flexible understanding of how institutions managed unwanted information. The unwanted information this morning arrived as his assistant, who knocked on the bulldozer of Horizon's Atlanta headquarters at 6:41 and said, with the careful neutrality of a person delivering something they would rather not deliver, "Sir, there's a situation on Flight 5112 you need to see." She handed him a tablet. The live stream was at 14,000 viewers. Haynes. Pitch watched it for 40 seconds without speaking. He watched the cabin. He watched the empty seat that was seat 4A, and the man in 4C who was not looking at anything in particular. He watched the edge of the frame where a woman's hand was visible holding the phone steady. He handed the tablet back. "Get me a car," he said. His assistant had already called for one. Haynes's office was 12 minutes from the terminal by the route his driver took when speed mattered. He was at the gate at 6:57. The technical hold on Flight 5112 was still active. He identified himself to the gate agent, not Glenn, who had gone on break, but a younger agent named Sasha who recognized Haynes' name and straightened considerably upon hearing it, and was on the jet bridge by 7:01. He paused at the aircraft door. Patrice was there, having been told someone from corporate was coming. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been in a difficult situation for the last 45 minutes and has just learned it is about to become more complicated. "Where is he?" Haynes said. "Seat 4A, sir." Haynes nodded and moved down the aisle. He was a tall man, Haynes. He moved through spaces with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never had to think about whether they belonged in them. He reached row 4 and looked at Damon, who looked back at him without surprise. "Damon," Haynes said. "Russell." Haynes looked at the empty 4B. Zara had gone to the restroom 30 seconds earlier. The timing coincidental, the camera still running on her tray table, pointed at an angle that Haynes did not notice. He sat down in 4B. "I want to get in front of this," he said. His voice was the voice of a man in a management meeting, reasonable and oriented toward solutions. "Tell me what you need." Damon looked at him. "What do you think I need, Russell? A formal apology from the airline? A statement from me personally? We can have communications draft something in the next hour. Something that makes clear this was a failure for a protocol, not of what?" Haynes paused. "Character," he said. "Of individual character. That this reflects a systemic gap in our training, and not any intentional Russell." Damon's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You came here to manage the story." Haynes met his eyes. "I came here to fix a problem. Those aren't the same thing." A beat of quiet. Haynes tried a different angle. "The live stream is going to keep running whether you're on this plane or not," Damon said. "That's not the conversation I'm interested in having." "Then what conversation are you interested in having?" Damon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder still open on his tray table. Then he looked back at Haynes. "Tell me about October," he said. Something happened in Haynes' face. It was fast, and if you were not watching for it, you would have missed it. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a small recalibration happening behind the expression. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, composed surface of a man who had spent 4 decades in boardrooms, learning to manage his face under pressure. "October," Haynes said, in the voice of a man buying time by repeating the word. "Board meeting. Agenda item 7. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones that had preceded it. It knew what it was. "I don't know what you've been told," Haynes began. "You proposed a restructuring of shareholder voting rights for operational emergency decisions," Damon said. His voice was calm and informational, like someone reading from a document, which he was, from memory. "The threshold you set was 65% of outstanding equity for full bipartisan authority. You chose 65 specifically, not 60, not 70, not 70. Haynes said nothing. "I own 61%, Damon said. The cabin was quiet around them. Most passengers had the focused non-attention of people pretending not to listen, which is its own form of listening. "The proposal didn't pass," Haynes said. "Not yet." Another silence. "Damon, that proposal was about governance structure, about operational efficiency in crisis scenarios. It was built to exclude me from a specific category of decisions while keeping me on the board," Damon said. "Which is the most expensive and complicated way I can think of to tell someone they don't belong somewhere." The words arrived quietly. They arrived precisely, and they arrived in the specific context of this morning, of the man in the polo shirt and the gate and the jet bridge and the sentence, "Make sure you're certain about this," in a way that gave them a resonance they would have had on their own, but that was now several times amplified. Haynes looked at him for a long moment. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally. "You owe me more than that, Russell. I know. But we'll start there." Haynes leaned forward, elbows on his knees, which was a posture Damon had seen him take in difficult board sessions when he was about to say something he'd rather not say but had run out of alternatives. "There are members of the board who are uncomfortable with the ownership structure," Haynes said. "That's not news to you, it's not?" The proposal was an attempt to create more operational flexibility in scenarios where a major shareholder might have conflicting interests. Damon waited. The language around the threshold was Haynes stumped. "I should have caught it, the way it was drafted. I should have flagged it before it went on the agenda. But you didn't. No, and you let it go to a vote." A pause. The vote didn't pass because 3 members blocked it, not because you did. Haynes did not contradict this. Outside, the sky was fully light now. The technical hold on Flight 512 had extended to its second hour. Somewhere in Seat 6C, Raymond Okafor was still writing in his notes app. Somewhere on the internet, the viewer count of Zara's live stream had passed 80,000. Damon's phone vibrated. He looked at it briefly. A notification from Adrian. Document sent. He put the phone face down. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," Damon said. "And then I want you to think carefully about whether you want to be part of it or not. Those are your 2 options. There isn't a third one." Haynes straightened slightly. "Okay, I'm going to build something," Damon said. "Not a lawsuit. Not a press campaign. Not a sensitivity training module that everyone clicks through in April and forgets about by June." He reached into his briefcase and produced the single sheet of paper he had drafted on his phone and sent to himself and printed it. He had printed it at the Gate Business Center while Glenn was making his call, which was the reason for his calm in the jet bridge, because he had not been standing there doing nothing. He had been deciding, and he handed it to Haynes. Haynes took it. "Read it." His expression changed as he read, the composed surface doing something more complex underneath. $40 million, he said, from Apex Capital, not from Horizon, not a donation, not a sponsorship. An independent foundation with its own board and its own budget that cannot be touched when your Q3 looks soft. Haynes kept reading. "The complaint system gets rebuilt entirely," Damon continued. "Direct reporting. Passenger files from their phone in the moment, and it goes straight to the Foundation Board and to Federal Aviation Oversight simultaneously. No airline employee touches it unless they're the subject of a complaint, in which case they're excluded from the process entirely. That's going to require DOT coordination," he said, witty. Haynes said, "Adrienne has been in contact with their office since 8 o'clock this morning." Haynes looked up. "You've been working on this since I was standing on the jet bridge," Damon said. "I had time." Haynes looked back at the paper. "Captain Garrett works with the team to redesign crew conflict protocols," Damon said. "Not as punishment, as contribution. He was in a broken system this morning. He made the wrong call, but the system handed him the conditions to make it. I want him helping to build a better one." "He'll agree to that?" "He already has." Damon paused. "I spoke to briefly ordered." Haynes looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was close to it. "Patrice Holden develops the passenger atcher interaction training," Damon continued. "Same reasoning. She knows exactly what she did wrong this morning, and that knowledge is worth something. Put it to work." Haynes set the paper down on the tray table between them. "And the man from 4A. 4, Damon corrected. "He's been in 4C the entire time." Heggs acknowledged that with a small, uncomfortable nod. "Craig Barton participates in the first accountability cohort," Damon said, "publicly, with his name attached. Not as a villain, he doesn't get to occupy that role, because the story this morning isn't about one man in a polo shirt. It's about a system that made his behavior feel ordinary to him. But he participates visibly, because that matters, because the people who watched this morning need to see that actions in the world have consequences in the world." Haynes was quiet for a moment. "He won't like that. His legal team will help him understand the alternative," Damon said. "The live stream is currently at." He checked his phone. 93,000 viewers. Craig's voice is clear in the footage. His words are very clear. His legal team will do the math. Across the aisle, in a seat with a partial view of row 4, Raymond Okafor wrote in his notes, "He's not angry. That's the thing. He's been calm the whole time. Not the calm of someone suppressing something. The calm of someone who already decided what they were going to do before any of this started." Haynes picked up the paper again. "Read it a second time, more slowly." "The board commitment," he said. "Your signature and formal adoption within 30 days. Adrian's team specifies the binding terms. If Horizon misses a benchmark in the first year, the Foundation gets automatic expanded audit rights. The teeth are in the contract, Russell, not in the press release." Haynes looked at him. "And the October proposal," Damon said. "It gets withdrawn permanently, not withdrawn. And the 3 board members who drafted it stepped down from the governance committee. Not the board, the committee. They gave up that seat this morning." The plane was very quiet. Someone toward the back coughed softly. The ventilation hummed. The light through the windows was the clear, flat light of a Tuesday morning in Atlanta that had fully committed to being a day. "You were always going to do something with this morning," Haynes said. It wasn't an accusation. It had the quality of a man arriving, slowly, at the shape of something he should have seen earlier. "No," Damon said. "Is it? I was going to fly to New York and read my quarterly projections. What I'm doing now is because of what happened this morning. Those are different things, Russell." Haynes was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the sheet of paper. He looked at the cabin around them, at the 60-something passengers who were all very carefully doing other things. He looked at the window, at the tarmac, at the pale sky above the terminal. He thought about October, about the meeting, about Agenda Item 7 and the threshold that had been set at 65 for a reason that everyone in the room had understood and no one had said out loud. He thought about the 30 numbers who did it and how he had read it before it went on the agenda and had thought, "I should flag this," and then had not flagged it. He thought about what the word negligence meant in the technical legal sense, and what it meant in the other sense, the one that didn't require a court to establish. "I'll sign it," he said. Damon nodded once, took the paper back, folded it along its crease, and placed it in his briefcase. "One more thing," he said. Haynes looked at him. "The name of the program is the 4A Initiative." Haynes was still for a moment. Then he gave a small, slow nod. It was the nod of a man accepting something he had, in some indirect and uncomfortable way, earned. Zaza came back from the restroom at 8 ISO-14 and found her phone still running, the camera still angled at the forward section of the cabin. The viewer count at a number she looked at twice because her brain kept adding zeros. She picked it up, looked at the comments scrolling faster than she could follow. She brought the camera back to face level, kept her voice low. "I don't know everything that just happened up there," she said. "But I know what I watched this morning, and I know what it means, and I'm going to keep watching." She turned the camera back toward the cabin. In 6C, Raymond Okafor added one more line to his notes. "She's going to be good at whatever she ends up doing." The technical hold on Flight 5112 lifted at 8:31. Boyd Garrett's voice came through the cabin speakers, even and professional. "Apologies for the delay. Estimated flight time to JFK was 3 hours and 18 minutes. Current weather in New York was clear. They would be pushing back in approximately 10 minutes. Damon heard the announcement from seat 4A. He set down his pen, reached for his coffee, what Patrice had replaced at some point in the last hour, without him asking. Still black, still no sugar, the cup warm in a way that suggested it had been placed recently. He held for a moment without drinking it. In his breast pocket, his phone had a document from Adrian that he had not yet opened. 40 pages, authenticated, carrying 11 signatures from an October board meeting, where a number had been selected with precision, and the precision had been message that was never supposed to be delivered directly. He would read it on the flight. He would sit in seat 4A and drink his coffee, and read the document that told him what he had already known, in the way you know things that had been carefully arranged to avoid your knowing them. And he would decide what to do with each page. He knew what he was going to find. He knew what he was going to do. He had known both things since he was standing in the jet bridge at 6 nooks in the morning with his briefcase on the floor beside him and the sound of ventilation in the walls and his father's voice doing what it always did, which was arrive without announcement and settle into the base of him like something that had been there the whole time. The plane began to move. Slow at first, the gentle backward pressure of the pushback, and then the engine note changing, and then the slow, deliberate taxi out toward the runway. Atlanta falling behind, the terminal receding. The tarmac opening up into the wide gray geometry of the airfield, with its lights and its markings, and its absolute indifference to the particular drama that had taken place in its orbit this morning. Damon opened his folder, found page 38, started reading. The bathroom on a commercial aircraft is not a place designed for reflection. 42 inches of fluorescent light and recycled air, and a mirror so small you
can only see yourself in pieces.
One eye at a time. The lower half of a face that has been holding a particular expression for the better part of 4 hours is only now in private allowing itself to do something else. Damon Reeves stood in front of that mirror somewhere over North Carolina and looked. Still there. All of it still there. The jaw set the same way it had been set since 6:17 in the morning, the eyes clear. the posture carrying nothing that anyone watching would read as trouble. But his hands were pressed flat against the edge of the sink, the knuckles gone pale at the pressure. That was the thing he could not entirely control, had not been able to control since Adrian's call, since the number she'd said landed in his chest the way a stone lands when you drop it from a height. Not loudly, just with the particular weight of something falling through to open air and arriving. He turned the cold water on, let it run over his wrists. $1.9 billion. That was what the Harmon Group had committed to the secondary fund launch. 18 months of work, 4 due diligence processes, 11 meetings in 3 cities. A relationship Adrian had spent 2 years cultivating with the patience of someone who understood that relationships of that scale were not built quickly and could not be rebuilt quickly once broken. And now their representative was calling to express concerns about reputational volatility. The water ran cold over his wrists. He looked at himself in the small mirror. At the fraction of his face he could see at any given moment. One eye, then the other, then the lower half where his jaw was set and had been set. He thought about what it would cost to let the Harmon deal go. He had already run the numbers, in the way he always ran numbers, which was not on paper, but in the specific and reliable space behind his eyes, where figures arranged themselves clearly when he gave them room. The secondary fund delayed 18 months. The expansion to timeline pushed back. A hard year, not catastrophic, survivable with restructuring, the portfolio intact, the core business intact. Everything that mattered about Apex Capital still standing on the other side of a difficult year. He thought about what it would cost to keep the deal. That calculation was shorter. It had one line in it: be smaller, be quieter, be less visible. Be the version of yourself that institutions like the Harmon Group were comfortable doing business with, which was the version that didn't make headlines or live streams or demands in airplane monopolies. The version that generated returns and sat at the table when invited and did not make anyone in the room recalibrate their understanding of how things work. Damon had spent 20 years building something real. The portfolio, the acquisitions. The particular ability he had developed for looking at an undervalued thing understanding with a precision that had made him genuinely wealthy and genuinely respected in the circles that understood what they were looking at is exactly what it could become. None of that had been given to him. None of it had arrived without cost. He had earned it at the granular level, deal by deal, year by year, in rooms where he was frequently person who looked like him, and had learned to treat that fact as data rather than grievance. And none of it, not $1, not one acquisition, not one Forbes cover, had insulated him from a Tuesday morning at 6:17 when a man in an expensive polo suit shirt decided, without asking a single question, that Damon is in the wrong place. The water kept running. He turned it off, dried his hands on the paper towel, looked at himself one more time in the small mirror. Then he pulled out his phone and called Adrienne. She picked up before the first ring finished. She always did when she knew he was going to call. "Walk me through it again," he said. A pause that was not hesitation. Adrian Cole did not hesitate. It was the pause of someone selecting the right words in the right sequence, because she had learned, over 11 years, that with Damon, right quantus mattered. As nice representative called the office at 9:42, she said. Their position is that they have concerns about what they're calling reputational volatility. The video is at 140,000 views as of 20 minutes ago. They want to know your intentions before they finalize the commitment. Meaning they want to know if I'm going to be quieted about this. That's what volatility means in this context, yes. And if I am. They move forward. The deal closes as scheduled. They've said as much, not in those words, but clearly enough. Damon leaned against the narrow wall of the bathroom. Adrienne, what do I actually lose if they walk? She had already run it. He knew she had run it before he called. She ran everything before he needed it, because that was made her exceptional at what she did. Secondary funds launch moves to Q2 of next year at earliest, she said. We restructure the expansion timeline. 18 months of delay, maybe 24 in the conservative model. It's a significant setback. It is not an unrecoverable one. Core portfolio, untouched. Revenue positive through the delay. We tighten the operating budget by about 12%. I've already identified where. Of course you have. Damon. Her voice shushed slightly. Not softer, exactly. more direct in the way she got when she was about to say something she had considered carefully and was delivering precisely. I want to be clear that whatever you decide, the math works. I'm not going to tell you one way costs nothing and the other way costs something. They both cost something. I just want you to be choosing, not reacting. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about something his father used to do. Bernard Reeves, when he was faced with this decision that had weight to it, would go quiet in a particular way. Not checked out, not absent, present in a different gear, moving more slowly than usual, like a man making sure his footing was solid before he put his weight on the next step. Damon had watched him do it many times as a child without understanding what he was watching. He understood it now because he had learned to do it himself. He was doing it now. 42 inches of fluorescent light, the quiet hum of the aircraft around him, 38,000 feet of open air below. "We move forward," he said. "A beat." "Okay," Adrian said. One word. Because she knew that voice, had known it for 11 years. Knew that when it said "we move forward" in that particular register, the decision had already been made somewhere prior to the conversation, and this was just the moment of saying it out loud. "I need the foundation framework started today," Damon said. "Full draft by end of week. Independent board structure. 3 external civil rights law background on at least one of them. Budget allocation, reporting structure, federal coordination. You already have the outline I gave you. I have it. Haynes signs the board commitment before Friday. Get the binding terms in front of him by tomorrow morning. Build in the audit expansion clause if they miss year 1 benchmarks. Already in the draft. The letter to Craig Barton goes out this afternoon. His legal team gets the full package, the footage, the documentation, the program terms. Make the voluntary participation path very clear and make the alternative equally clear. Understood. One more thing. He paused. Zara Osei, the woman in 4B. I want to know where she is with her bar exam. Adrian was quiet for half a second. I'll find out. Good. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time. I'll call you when we land. He hung up. Stood in the small room for a moment longer. Then he opened the door and walked back into the world. The cabin had the settled quiet of a long flight finding its rhythm. Seatbelt signs off. The service cart moving slowly through the aisles toward the back. The overhead lights at their cruising's altitude softness. Outside every window, the same blue-white sky, the same high-altitude light that made everything look clear and a little unreal. Damon walked back to seat 4A and sat down. He opened his briefcase, retrieved the document Adrian had sent before takeoff. 40 pages. Printed at the Gate Business Center while Glenn was on the radio, in the 10 minutes between his conversation with Glenn and his return to the aircraft. He had read the first 8 pages in the terminal and the next 12 during the hold, and was now ready for the rest. He settled the document in his lap and started reading. The board meeting transcript from October was, in its surface appearance, a routine governance document. Agenda items 1 through 6 were standard. Capital allocation review. Quarterly performance summary. 2 committee reports. A vote on a vendor contract that had passed unanimously. The material that made up the unglamorous majority of board meeting minutes and was important in the way that all institutional plumbing is important visibly until something went wrong. Agenda item 7 was 7 pages long. Damon read it without rushing. The proposal was written in the specific language of institutional governance, with a language designed to make its intentions legible only to people who already know what they're looking at. On the surface, a modernization of voting protocols for operational emergency scenarios, intended to streamline decision-making in time-sensitive situations. The threshold of 65% had been framed as a standard that ensured broad shareholder consensus before major operational commitments were made. 65%. The number sat on the page with the casual authority of something that had been chosen for a reason no one would state. Damon read the discussion notes beneath the proposal. The 3 board members who had drafted it, their names were there, their contributions to the discussion recorded in the clipped and neutral summary style of official minutes had spoken about efficiency, about clarity of mandate, about the importance of ensuring that operational decisions reflected genuine consensus rather than the position of a single stakeholder. He read those 2 words twice. Why? Then he turned to the vote record. 7 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention. Haynes had abstained, not voted against, abstained. Damon sat with that for a moment, turned it over, understood what it meant and what it didn't mean. Haynes had not approved the proposal. He had also not opposed it. He had placed himself in the careful middle ground of a man who wanted to be able to say later that he hadn't supported something, while also not expending any of his political capital on the board to stop it. It was a very specific kind of cowardice. Not dramatic, not unusual. The institutional kind, which was the most common kind, which was the kind that allowed a proposal to advance 7 steps down the road before anyone thought to call it by its real name. The proposal had failed. 3 members had blocked it, their names also in the record, their opposition stated clearly, which Damon noted and would remember. It had failed, but it had been proposed. It had been on an agenda. It had gone to a vote with 7 votes in favor and 1 abstention from the chairman. On a threshold designed to be 1 number above his stake, he finished the document, set it face down on the tray table, looked out the window for a moment at the high blue sky and the cloud layer far below, white and solid looking, like a floor made of something you could almost stand on. Boyd Garrett came out of the cockpit at 9:47. He moved through the cabin differently than he had at 6:23. Not in his posture. The posture was still straight, still captainship, still carrying the professional authority of a man who ran an aircraft and knew how. The difference was in the quality of attention around him, the way his eyes moved, the slight additional weight in his step of a man who Karaskin seems to and is aware of carrying it. He reached row 4. Damon looked up. Garrett stood in the aisle and held Damon's gaze without looking away, which was not easy, and which cost him something. And the cost was visible in the careful steadiness he was maintaining around it. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "I've been thinking about what I said to you this morning." Damon waited. "I asked you to leave your seat," Garrett said. "I made that call, Beach. I looked at the situation, and I made a read, and the read was wrong." He stopped. Started again with the precision of a man making sure he got something said correctly. "It wasn't wrong because of who you are. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know who you were when I made it. The call was wrong because of what I was looking at and what I assumed it meant. I assumed you were the problem before I had any evidence that you were the problem." Damon said nothing. Let him finish. "I'm sorry," Garrett said. "Not for the optics of it. Not because of what this morning became. Because what I did was wrong. That's the beginning and end of it. A beat for quiet with them." "I appreciate you saying it that way," Damon said. Garrett gave a small nod. "I was told about the program, the training redesign. I know. I wanted your team involved in building it, not as penance. Because you know from the inside what went wrong, and that knowledge is worth using." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I'll do it," he said. "Whatever's useful." He straightened, held Damon's gaze one more moment. Then he turned and walked back to the cockpit. Not hurrying, carrying the same weight as before, but differently now. The weight of a man who had said the true thing and had not been destroyed by it, and was learning, in real time, what that meant. In seat 6C, Raymond Okafor wrote, he apologized correctly. "I've seen a lot of apologies that weren't really apology. This was the real kind." Patrice Holden had been running on the professional autopilot of 19 years of in-flight service since approximately 8. Which was when she had finished a conversation with Haynes in the forward galley and returned to her duties, and discovered that her hands could do the job while her brain went somewhere else entirely. The place her brain kept going was a question. The same question, arriving each time from a slightly different angle, but always the links the same question at the center of it. When she had seen Damon in seat 4A at 6, before Craig Barton said a word, before the situation existed in any form. Flat, clean moment when she had cynically looked down the aisle and registered a man sitting in a business class seat. What had she assumed? She kept trying to soften the answer, kept trying to find a version of it that was more charitable to herself. Kept arriving at the same place. She had assumed he might have made a mistake, not consciously, not any awareness of the assumption as an assumption. Just, it had been there. A slight readiness to correct, a ceaseless opening to the possibility of error that she did not feel when she looked at passengers who did not look like Damon. It had been there before anything happened, before Craig spoke, before the situation became a situation. It had been there from the first glance. She was working the service cart through the business class cabin when she arrived at row 4. She set down the tray of coffee refills, looked at Damon. He glanced up from his document. Mr. Reeves, she said. Her voice was level because she had decided how she was going to say this, and she was going to say it correctly. I've been thinking about what I did this morning, not about how I handled the situation after it escalated, about the moment before, about what I assumed before anyone told me anything. She paused. I assumed you might be in the wrong place, she said. I didn't know I was assuming it, but I was, and I want you to know that I understand that now. Not because of anything that happened after, because of what I looked at before. She held his. Damon looked at her for a moment, at the steadiness she was maintaining, at the specific courage it took to say the thing she'd just said, which was a harder and more honest thing than most people managed to say, even when they had months to prepare for it rather than 4 hours on a plane. That's the thing that's hardest to see, he said. The part before. Yes, she said. And you saw it. She held his gaze. I did. He nodded once. The nod of acknowledgement rather than absolution, which was the right kind, because what she'd described didn't require his absolution. It required her own reckoning. She was doing it. She refilled his coffee without being asked. Still black, still no sugar. Thank you, she said, and moved to the next row. The plane landed at JFK at 10:14. A clean landing. Though the wheel dropped round drama and the thrust reversers came on, the plane decelerated through the long, shallow curve of the rollout, and then they were on the ground, taxiing, the cabin lights coming up, the seatbelt sign chiming off, the ordinary sounds of arrival, bags being unzipped, phones coming out of airplane mode, the collective breath release of a cabin full of people who were now somewhere they had been trying to get to. Russell Haynes was already on his phone. Damon could hear the low, serious register of his voice from where he sat, but not the words. He was in 4B, where he had moved during the flight to continue the conversation with Damon and had stayed working on his own calls for the last 2 hours. At one point, he had asked Damon a question about the foundation board structure, and Damon had answered it, and they had worked through 2 more items on the framework document before he had moved on to his own calls, and Damon had returned to his reading. It was not comfortable, but it was functional, and functional was where things started. Craig Barton had not said anything since his reassigned seat in 4C. He had not read his folder, he had not finished his coffee, he had sat with a face-down phone, and the replaying of his partner's message, and the slow, effortful process of a man trying to understand the shape of something he had done. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, he did not move immediately the way he normally moved. He sat while the cabin began to shift around him. People standing, reaching for bags, moving toward the aisle. He sat and thought about what he had said this morning. Not the initial claim, this is my seat, because he had genuinely, if carelessly, believed it. But what had come after? The tone. The certainty before any evidence. The way he had talked to Patrice rather than to Damon, as though Damon were a variable in the situation rather than a person in the middle of it. The moment he had said, loud enough for the rows of around him to hear, that he just needed someone simple to sort out the confusion. The confusion. He thought about the word confusion and what he had meant by it, and what it had looked like from the outside, and whether those 2 things were the same. They were not the same. He was arriving, slowly and not painlessly, at the understanding that they were not the same at all. He stood and retrieved his carry-on, moved toward the aisle, reached the door where Patrice was standing in the farewell position. She said, "Have a safe onward journey, sir," not the usual closing something plainer. Craig stopped, looked at her. "I didn't handle this morning well," he said. Patrice looked at him. "No, sir," she said. "You didn't." He nodded, walked off the plane. Patrice watched him go. Then she turned to the next passenger. In seat 6C, Raymond Okafor was the second to last person to leave the business class cabin. He passed row 4 on his way out and paused. "Mr. Reeves," he said. Damon looked up. "Raymond Okafor. We spoke 2 years ago, do financial piece on funds restructuring." "I remember," Damon said. "I was on this flight," Raymond said. "I watched this morning. I know you were here." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "I took notes," he said. "I'm not going to use them without your permission." Damon looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't say anything to you." Raymond gave a small nod. "When you're ready to talk about it, I'm ready to listen." "I'll have Adrian call you," Damon said, but Raymond nodded again and continued down the aisle. Zara Osei was the last passenger in the business class cabin when Damon finally closed his folder, capped his pen, and placed both in his briefcase. She had ended the live stream an hour into the flight, when it had become clear that the immediate drama had resolved, and what would remain was the quieter and less streamable process of things actually changing. She had watched the viewer count sit at 212,000 for a long moment before she stopped the broadcast. She was packing her laptop bag when Damon stood and settled his briefcase over his shoulder. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She had the slightly stunned quality of someone who has been running on adrenaline and is only now, with the plane on the ground and the situation resolved, becoming aware of how much the last 4 hours had cost her. "How'd you sleep last night?" he said. She blinked. "I didn't, really. Exam prep, constitutional law, final tomorrow." He reached into his briefcase, retrieved the cupboard, plain heavy stock out, name and number only, and placed it on her tray table. "When you pass the bar," he said. "Not if." She looked at the card. "You don't know that I'll pass." "I watched you make a difficult decision under pressure this morning," he said, "with no preparation and no certainty about how it would be received, and you made the right call and you held your nerve for 4 hours. He paused. "You'll pass." She looked at the card for another moment. Then she picked it up and put it in the front pocket of her laptop bag, in the zippered section, the section she used for things she could not afford to lose. "Thank you," she said. "For I don't know exactly what I did this morning, but whatever it was." "You held up a camera," he said, "when it was easier to." She nodded. He picked up his briefcase and walked off the plane. The terminal at JFK in the mid-morning had its own specific atmosphere. The controlled motion of 1,000 people in transit, the departure board cycling, the particular ambient noise of an airport in full operation. Gates and announcements and the rolling of wheels on hard floors and all the ordinary human traffic of people going somewhere. Damon moved through it at his own pace. Adrian's was waiting at the base of the escalator near the exit, which was where she always waited when she met him at an airport. Tablet in hand. 3 calls flagged. The foundation framework document open on the screen, already partially drafted, because she had been working on it since he'd called from the bathroom at 38,000 feet. She fell to step beside him without ceremony. "Framework looks workable," she said. "I have 2 questions about the independent board structure. Go ahead. Term? Do we set them?" 4 years. Renewable ones. And the federal coordination, DOT, or also FAA. Both. If we're building a reporting system that goes into aviation safety culture, we need both agencies in the room from the start. I'll add FAA to the meeting request. She made a note. The Harmon Group called again while you were in the air. I assumed they would. They're withdrawing the commitment. I know. She walked beside him in silence for a moment. Outside the terminal of her glass, the runway was visible in the flat morning light. Planes moving in their slow and ordered patterns. Each one part of the system so large and so specific that you could spend a lifetime learning its rules. "We're going to have a hard year," Adrian said. "Yes." "And then we're going to be fine." "Yes." She nodded. "Okay then, back to the tablet. I have a call with Haynes' legal team at 2. Foundation terms, the governance committee restructuring, the October proposal, withdrawal. I'll need you on the call for the last 20 minutes. Block it." Already blocked. She scrolled to the next item. Zara Osei. She's taking the New York bar exam in 6 weeks. She's clerking part-time at a civil rights firm in Brooklyn. Her professor at Columbia describes her as the most instinctively sound legal thinker he's taught in 15 years, which is the kind of thing law professors say and usually mean. Damon looked at her. "How did you get all of that in 2 hours?" "I called her law school owl," Adrian said. "I said I was conducting a reference check for a potential opportunity, which was true. Set up a call with her for next week. Done." She made the note. "One more thing. Tell me. Raymond Okafor's newsletter goes out on Thursday mornings. He has 40,000 subscribers. Based on the note he sent our office 20 minutes ago asking for comment, I believe there's going to be a piece about this morning in Thursday's edition." Damon considered that. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd have a statement by Wednesday afternoon. Draft it tonight. I'll review it in the morning. It'll be in your inbox at 7. They reached the exit. The automatic doors opened and the outside air came in, warm, carrying the particular smell of a New York morning, exhaust and concrete and something green from somewhere not too far away. Damon stopped for a moment. Adrian stopped beside him. He looked at the cars moving in the pickup lane, the taxis and ride shares, and the occasional black car with a sign in the window, the ordinary choreography of an airport exit. Nothing remarkable about any of it. Adrienne, he said. Yeah. My father worked 31 years in construction electrical in Macon. He had a master's license. He was never late. He never got fired. He paused. In 1989, a site manager told him his certification needed to be verified. He went home, got his documents, came back the next morning, was reinstated by noon. The manager said sorry for the trouble. Nothing else ever happened. Adrian was quiet. He never told me that story himself, Damon said. I heard it from my mother the year after he died. She said he'd never wanted to make it into something I carry. He thought it was his to carry, not mine. He looked at the moving traffic. He was wrong about that, he said. Not about carrying it. He was right that it was his. But he was wrong that giving it to me would have been a burden. He paused. It would have been a foundation. Adrian said nothing for a moment, then, What do you want to do with it? I already am, he said. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the car. 6 months later, on a Tuesday in April, the 4A initiative held its first operational review in a conference room in Midtown Manhattan. The room had 8 people in it, Damon at the head of the table, Adrian to his left. 3 members of the newly constituted independent board, civil rights attorney from D.C. named Wanda Cross, who had spent 20 years in federal litigation, a former DOT oversight director named Leonard Park, and a consumer advocacy specialist named Beth Holloway, who had built and run 2 national complaint systems and knew exactly where the gaps in them were. A representative from the FAA's Civil Rights Office, a paralegal from the Foundation's legal team, and Zara Osei at the far end of the table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of bad conference room coffee, looking at a spreadsheet of the first 3 weeks of data from the new passenger reporting system. She had passed the bar in February, first attempt. Her score in civil rights law had been the highest in her cohort, which was the part she had not told anyone except her mother and Adrian because she was 26 and new to the room and had been raised to let the works speak before the person did. She was learning, in these sessions, that the work spoke loudest when you the right questions of it, and she was good at that, had always been good at that, was learning to trust that it was a skill rather than luck. Walk us through the data, Damon said, Zara. Zasa looked at her spreadsheet. 43 complaints filed in the first 22 days across Horizon's domestic routes. 31 of the 43 came from passengers of color. The most common pattern, 17 of the 43, involves a passenger being questioned about the validity of their seat assignment, when the adjacent passenger in a different demographic was not questioned in a comparable situation. Verification rate? Wanda Cross asked. All 43 went through the full process. Response within 14 days in 40 of them. The other 3 are inside the window. Management intercepts? 0, Zara said. The system is working as designed. Nothing routed through airline management. Straight to the board, straight to federal oversight. Leonard Park made a note. And the airline's response to the verified complaints? 4 formal policy violations flagged so far. All 4 resulted in crew debriefs within 72 hours. The debriefs are happening. That's new. Damon looked at the numbers on her spreadsheet. He had seen preliminary versions of these numbers as Adrian's reports over the past weeks, but there was something different about seeing them in this room, around this table, produced by a system that had not existed 6 months ago and now was running, something that was not quite satisfaction, something more durable than that. Wanda Cross leaned forward. Zara, you flagged something in your pre-read about aggregate reporting. Yes. Zasa turned a page on her legal pad. The public-facing aggregate report, the anonymized version we post quarterly. I want to propose we move that to monthly. The deterrent effect of visible accountability is significantly higher when the data is current. Quarterly data is history. Monthly data is a mirror. A monthly data is a mirror. Damon looked at her. She was looking at her legal pad. Still, not performing the line, just having said it because it was what she thought. I agree, he said. We'd need to update the publication framework, Adrian noted. I can draft the amendment, Zara said. I can have it to you by Friday. Thursday, Damon said. She nodded, made a note, didn't blink. He watched her for a moment, watched the way she worked, the legal pad full of her own notes before the meeting started, the questions she asked that were precise rather than broad. The way she held a position when challenged without raising her voice and without retreating. The camera had been one decision. This was who had made it. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it ended, Damon stayed at the table while the room cleared. Adrian gathered her things. Zara was the last to leave, putting her legal pad in her bag, capping her pen. At the door, she paused. "Mr. Reeves." He looked up. "Thank you for the call," she said. "After the bar results, you earned it." She nodded, held the door. "I've been thinking about something you said on the plane, that I held up a camera when it was easier not to." She paused. "I've been thinking about whether that was courage or whether it was just having enough context to understand what I was looking at." Damon considered that. "What's the difference?" She thought about it for a moment. "Courage implies you might have chosen differently. Context implies you couldn't have done anything else once you understood what was in front of you." He looked at her. "And which one was it?" She held his book. She said, "I think it was both." She left. Damon sat at the table for a moment in the empty conference room, the data from the first 3 weeks of the 4A initiative on the screen at the end of the room. 43 complaints, 31 from passengers of color, 17 seat assignments questioned without cause, 17 people who had been in some version of what he had been in, on some planes, at some hour of some morning. Some of them had documentation that protected them. Some of them had had no one in the adjacent seat with a camera. Some of them had quietly moved. Some of them had quietly moved and gone home and not told anyone, because the calculation of what it cost to say something versus what was cost to say nothing had run fast in their head and out in favor of silent sites. Their complaints were in the system now. Their complaints were going somewhere that was not a void. He thought about the man in Macon in 1989, standing at a kitchen window, looking at a fence and an oak tree. About what it would have meant to him to know that something he'd carried quietly for 30 years had been put to use, that the weight of it had been picked up by someone who knew its value and built with it. He thought his father would have approved of that. He picked up his briefcase and walked out of the conference room. 3 weeks after the April review, Damon took Horizons Airlines Flight 52, Atlanta to New York, departing 6:15. He was on plane before the gate announcement finished. Briefcase under the seat in front of him. Folder open, pen ready. Seat 4A. He had not requested it specifically. It had simply been his assigned seat when he booked the ticket. The same way as was his assigned seat every time he flew this route, because he always booked 4A when it was available, which it usually was, because not everyone wanted to sit directly behind the galley partition. But Damon liked the additional legroom and the proximity to the front exit and the way the morning light came through the window at that angle in the early hours. He had always liked seat 4A. That was a fact that predated this story and would outlast it. The coffee was ordered. The folder was open. The tarmac outside was gray in the early morning, the ground crews moving in the yellow service lights, the sky at its eastern edge beginning to suggest what it would become. Patrice Holden was working the morning flight. She had been assigned it through the standard scheduling process. She had not avoided it. She had also not requested it. She had simply shown up and picked up the manifest and started her pre-flight procedures. And when she reached row 04 and saw the name on the seat assignment, she had looked at it for a moment and then continued her procedures. When the boarding was complete and the pre-flight checks were done and the morning service was beginning, she came to row 4 with the coffee. She sat on the table. She looked at Damon. He looked up. Their eyes met with the directness of two people who have been through something together, not comfortably, not without cost on both sides, and have arrived somewhere neither of them would have predicted at the beginning of it. "Welcome back, Mr. Reeves," she said. Not because he was the chairman of the fund that held majority equity in her airline, not because she was afraid of him or owed him something, or had been told by someone in corporate to treat him carefully, because he was a passenger on her flight. Because that had always been sufficient reason. Because she understood now in a way she had not understood at 6:09 on a Tuesday morning 6 months ago, that sufficient reason was the whole of it, that it didn't require any additional information, that it never had. Damon looked at her for a moment. He smiled, small and real and its own, the kind of smile that doesn't ask anything from the person it's given to, the kind that just exists because it's the true response to the moment. "Thank you," he nodded. Moved on to the next row. Damon turned back to his folder, found his page, started reading. Outside the oval window, the Atlanta tarmac ran wet and gray in the early morning light. Ground crews moved between planes in the half-dark. The sky above the terminal was doing what skies do at that hour in that city, becoming, slowly and without announcement, something you could see by. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied, the engines climbed, the runway opened ahead, and the plane accelerated on it. And then the wheels left the ground and Atlanta fell away below. And there was nothing beneath them but air and altitude, and the long, clear morning opening up above the clouds. Damon read his quarterly projections, turned a page. The coffee was exactly right.